In February of last year, I found a new job at a 24-hour convenience store in my city. I'd been jobless since the lockdowns began, but assumed that I'd be able to return after everything was over. Unfortunately, the restaurant didn't survive, and I was left without employment for a long time afterwards. This didn't mean that I wasn't looking. I tried sending out resumes online, but got no replies. I don't have any friends that can help, so I took to the street, going door to door filling out applications. A few places called me in for interviews, but the jobs were either part-time or didn't pay enough. It made no sense to me to give up a reliable government check for a crappy job that paid maybe half, if I was lucky. I'd long given up when I got a call from the gas station. And all was going well until the manager mentioned the shift was overnights. I'm not a night person, nor am I fond of the people who are. And just before I could turn it down, he added that the shift paid an extra $1 an hour. And believe it or not, that changed matters greatly. I would have been an idiot to say no. My first month, I worked alongside the manager as he trained me. We got along really well, and I look forward to working with him for the foreseeable future. The work itself was simple. Even the customers didn't seem as bad as I thought they'd be. My concerns about robbery quickly faded on the first night. The store just so happened to be a regular stop-off for cops as they patrolled. An hour didn't go by without one or two dropping in for coffee or just to pass the time talking. The only real downside was that it could be boring sometimes, but after I learned how to space out my tasks, even that ceased to be a concern. Considering what I was being paid, I had no actual reason to gripe. It's hard to complain when you're getting paid to stand around and talk for most of the night. Just as I was beginning to warm up to the place, I got some bad news. Carlos, the store manager and the guy who had been training me, was going back to days. It appeared that I'd misread the circumstances. This had been his intent all along. I was very nervous about who'd be replacing him. His laid-back attitude made him easy to talk to and fun to work with. I was afraid the new guy would be the exact opposite. I was left with little choice but to wait and see. Maybe the new person wouldn't be that bad, and when I arrived for work the next Monday night, I got my answer. Standing behind the counter was a tall and gaunt shadow of a man. The rings under his eyes made him look half dead. I walked up and introduced myself. As I offered my hand, he let out a sort of loud yawn directly in my face. He stretched his arms out wide and only then slowly lowered his hand to meet mine. His name was Marc, and this was his first night on graveyard shift, and I could tell he wasn't happy about it. It wasn't a great first impression, but I could understand his reluctance to be there. I'd been in his position until very recently, and I wasn't totally acclimated to it myself. We began the night by choosing what tasks we wanted, an exercise that shouldn't have taken more than a few minutes, but it drug on forever. Any excuse that he could think of, he made, and out of frustration, I offered to do all of the outside jobs. He reluctantly agreed, and I could tell from his tone things were going to be difficult, at least for a while. I left him alone to help customers when I cleaned up the parking lot. When I was out there, a cop pulled up. The two of us talked about the weather or something equally unimportant for about 10 minutes before he left on a call. I returned inside and Marc made a rude comment about the cop. I just ignored him, but he kept it up, and I could tell that he must have had a bad history with the police or something. I didn't say anything, and I guess he got the hint. He went back to being silent, and I got back to work. This would be the norm for the next 3 months. I did briefly consider asking to go to days, but I wasn't willing to lose the extra money. I could only hope that he hated the job so much that he'd soon quit, and I'd get to work with Carlos again. Until then, I just gritted my teeth and tried to stay busy. Soon after Marc began, I started to notice a weird habit that he had. Sometimes I'd be outside and glance into the store and he'd be missing. The rules stated that one of us had to be behind the counter or nearby at all times. He continued disappearing and I didn't know where. And by chance, one night I saw him shuffling off to the restroom. I started watching him closer, and sure enough, every time I went outside, he'd slip off to the restroom when nobody was around. I tried to come up with a good reason. The only possibility was that he had had an incontinence issue or something weird like that. I couldn't imagine how terrible of a thing that would be to deal with at such a young age. I'd probably be grumpy most of the time, and I certainly wouldn't want to talk to anyone, so I kind of just chalked it up in my head to that. After that revelation, I tried to be nicer and more thoughtful toward him. Maybe he wasn't really all that bad. His attitude was somewhat off-putting, but I was pretty sure that was because of his bathroom problems, and I was sure that he'd stop nodding off all the time once he got used to the late nights. Just because I acclimated in a couple of weeks didn't mean he would. From then on, I focused more on myself and stopped worrying about his performance. Our working relationship began to improve from then on. We'd worked out a system that worked for the both of us, and we no longer butted heads. There hadn't been any complaints from Carlos. If he had no problems with the way we were doing things, then why should I? I refocused on myself and left Marc alone to do the same. Although far from a fun environment, work became less about my coworker's personality and more like most of my former jobs, just getting through the shift and getting home. Then, as the weeks passed, a funny thing happened. I was warming up to the guy. As long as he avoided certain topics, he could be okay to talk to. Maybe I hadn't given him enough of a chance, but I'd never get a chance to find out though. The two of us were working as we usually did. I was outside getting a measure of the fuel tanks when a customer yelled out to me for assistance. I glanced in and noticed Marc was nowhere to be seen. It wasn't unusual, but he was generally good about coming out when the door chime went off. I dropped what I was doing and returned inside to ring up the customer. Marc was still nowhere to be seen. I remained behind the counter in case another customer came in. 15 minutes passed before I began to work. Marc had never been missing this long before. Although reluctant, I walked back to the restroom and lightly knocked on it. I asked if everything was okay, but I got no answer. I decided to give him a little more time. When I came back 10 or so minutes later, I did the same thing and still got no reply, and I was beginning to get scared now. Just in case he'd fallen asleep, I pounded on the door and called out to him. No answer again. He must be having a medical emergency, I thought. That was my only conclusion. And so I stood back and just kicked the door with all my force. The flimsy door flew open and I barged into a terrible sight. It was far worse than I'd expected. Slumped over before me was Marc on the toilet, and I rather sheepishly reached over to check his pulse, but there wasn't one. His skin was ice cold, and a whitish foam was on his mouth. I guess I must have seized up or disassociated, whatever you call it. There are a few minutes that I can't account for. At some point, the door chime went off and jarred me back to my senses. I closed the door behind me and headed for the counter. The customer paid and left, and I returned to the restroom. As I entered this time, I stepped on something, and I looked down and realized that it was a needle. And the seriousness of the situation finally dawned on me, and I called 911. While I waited for the police to arrive, I drew up an out-of-order sign for the restroom and taped it on the door. I also took that time to call Carlos. At that moment, I only mentioned that Marc had a medical emergency and was rushed to the hospital. I don't think it was my place to determine what had killed him despite the evidence. The police and ambulance showed up not long after and took Marc away. The cops and I spoke for the better part of 2 hours, and during this time, Carlos arrived and also spoke to them. I waited until it was just the two of us before I told him the full story. He seemed just as shocked as I had been. Neither of us had ever seen any sign that he was an addict. Although in retrospect, his long trips to the restroom and nodding off may have been an obvious indication to a more experienced person. I didn't bother to mention those facts to Carlos, though. I didn't want him to know that there had been problems between us. We worked the remainder of the shift, after which I just went home. When I returned the next night, I was pleased to see Carlos there. He was back on graveyard until we found a replacement, and now that things were back to the way they used to be, I found myself somewhat torn inside. I loved working with Carlos, but it seemed a terrible way to get him back. Hardly worth the life of a fellow human, you know. I fought with this for several weeks, but it seemed as time passed, all the bad aspects of working with Marc came creeping back to me. The facts were that he was a miserable person that made everyone around him miserable. I excused this in light of his perceived medical condition, but now that I knew the truth, I found myself feeling a lot less compassionate. I couldn't help but get angry at myself for being such a pushover. Why'd I let him take advantage of my kindness? After all, no one has any right to suck you into a hole with them, no matter their plight, and as you can see, I may have still been in shock at the time. My emotions were really all over the place. When the funeral came around, I filled in on a day shift so one of the other employees could attend. Marc had been on days for over a year before moving to nights and had managed to befriend a few of the other employees. Behind closed doors, I was something of a nervous wreck, and the idea of going to the funeral scared the crap out of me. Carlos continued working with me for another 2 weeks until we found a new employee to take Marc's place. This was Crystal, and she was everything Marc was not. Her upbeat and bubbly personality made work fun, even more fun than Carlos. Her presence did a lot to help me get past what had happened. I wasn't the only one who enjoyed her presence either. I noticed how much more often the night shift officers came around, and our number of regulars increased too. As much as I fought it, it didn't take long for us to catch feelings for one another. A few months passed before we realized the relationship was actually becoming serious. At this point, we discussed our options, and Crystal chose to move to days. As with most workplaces, it's frowned upon for employees to date each other. Since there were talk of me becoming an assistant manager, she decided it would be better if she moved. I knew I had no say in the matter, so I just nodded my head in agreement. And as I write this, I'm currently night manager of the store. It's not a major accomplishment, but considering I was unemployed a year ago, I'm happy to have achieved it. My coworker at present is a short and funny guy named Damon. He is a very hard worker and we get along well. Sometimes in the quiet moments of the shift, I catch myself remembering my short time working with Marc and all the turmoil that came with it. I've somewhat softened on the guy. Despite the cloud of misery he carried along with him, I can only guess how hard living with an addiction like this must have been. I realized I probably could have been more understanding, and in my defense, I'd really tried to be. But that's all in the past now, I suppose. Wherever he ended up, I hope it's a happier place. I collect Ouija boards. I know how strange this sounds. Most people collect stamps, coins, vinyls, posters, and the like. I should probably preface this by saying I have pretty extensive knowledge of the paranormal. I've been having experiences with it since I was a child. This led me to delve into the world of paranormal investigation in my teens and early 20s, which coincided with my beginning to collect the boards. Since then, I have amassed quite a collection, but there is one that I refuse to even keep in my house. I'll call it the Salem board. I used to do special effects makeup for films, and I was in Salem, Massachusetts for a job. As you have probably gathered, I am a lover of the strange, unusual, and all things creepy, so I was thrilled by this opportunity. I had gotten into town a few days before filming began so I could prep, but also so I could do a little sightseeing. I was wandering through some of the shops and happened to walk into one that had a pretty large collection of Ouija boards. Some were vintage, some were etched glass, and some were burned wood. At the back of the shop there was a locked display case which immediately caught my eye. Alone on the top shelf was a board that looked as though it was the cross-section of a tree stump. It had the usual markings of a Ouija board, but they looked to be hand-carved into the wood. It was also covered with runes. I went to the guy behind the counter and asked how much it was. "It's not for sale," he said quietly. "Why not?" I asked. He looked back at the cabinet and then back at me. "That board is made from a tree that was used to hang witches during the Salem witch trials." I looked at him skeptically. That was a pretty tall claim. I really did want the board, though. It would look great in my collection and be a cool conversation piece. "Are you sure you don't want to sell it?" Once again, he looked between me and the cabinet. $150. Cash. No returns." I handed him the money and he walked to the cabinet to unlock it. He must have noticed the confused look on my face when he handed me the board. "It doesn't come with a planchette. This board was not exactly meant to be used." I wasn't exactly sure how to respond to that, so I just said thanks and left the shop. Fast forward a few months, I am back in Seattle in my one-bedroom apartment where I lived alone. I put the Salem board in my box in my closet since I was waiting on a new display case, and didn't really have anywhere else to put it. My closet had 2 sliding doors and a shelf on top of the bar where you would hang clothes. The shelf was actually pretty large, so it accommodated the box with room to spare. I had gone to bed that night and fell asleep with the TV on. I was awoken at around 3 a.m. by the sound of something hitting my closet door. I checked to make sure my ball python, Kronos, was in his cage, since every time he got out he would try and get in my closet where the hot water heater was. I saw he was curled up under his log and cautiously opened the closed door to see the box had fallen off the shelf and was now resting against the door. I was puzzled at this, but thought in my sleepiness that I had just not pushed it back far enough. I pushed the box back and went back to sleep. About 30 minutes later, I heard another noise from my closet, but this time it was much louder. When I opened my eyes, I could see that one of the closet doors had been pushed outwards. The box had fallen off the shelf again, but this time had done it with so much force it had wedged itself between my clothes and the door. At this point, I was becoming a bit concerned. Instead of putting the box back on the shelf, I packed it on the floor of my closet and shut the door. When I woke up in the morning, I turned over to grab my phone off the stand and saw my closet door wide open and the box had been pushed out into the middle of my room. At this point, I became concerned. This was an object with a lot of emotion attached to it, a lot of anger and a lot of pain and suffering. I thought it best to keep it in the box and put the box in my storage unit. A few years go by and my mom keeps bugging me to clean out some things from the storage unit since she needed some space for her stuff. It was in the middle of summer and the storage unit was sweltering. I was going through boxes, aimlessly tossing things in the piles when I came across the box. The room was suddenly freezing. I took the lid off and looked down. The Salem board was sitting on top of several other Ouija boards I had acquired over the years. They had all been cracked in half down the middle. All of them, except the Salem board. I stared into the box, trying to comprehend what I was looking at. These boards looked like someone had broken them over their knee. Surely not the result of a box being dropped or jostled. I removed the board from the box and placed it in the wooden chest I had acquired from my great-grandmother, who had considered herself to be a witch. It remains in that box to this day. I believe there are forces in this world that we will never understand. I am sure you are wondering why I didn't get rid of the board. In a way, I feel tied to it. It called to me, and I answered. I consider myself its keeper. As long as it's with me, everyone else is safe from whoever or whatever is attached to it. When I was 8, I would walk to my townhome approximately 10 minutes away from my school. I would be home by myself every day for about an hour and a half because my parents worked and my older brother went to a different school. I always used this alone time to sink into the couch and watch cartoons before my family came home and took over. I actually really enjoyed the alone time. I was raised in a very Christian home and was very sheltered. I would get in trouble watching Power Rangers sometimes because the bad guys were too evil. I remember being taught that after you die, you either go to heaven or hell. You don't get to say whether you're going or not, so that means there are no such things as ghosts, or so I thought. One day after school, I come home to the same routine, but this time, standing in the corner, was a dark figure the height of the door frame staring at me. It looked like a textbook Grim Reaper minus a scythe. It had a long black, tattered robe with skeletal features showing. The most disturbing thing was its grin. It looked like a skeleton, but wore a long grin. Keep in mind, I had never heard of The Nightmare Before Christmas or anything else I could relate it to. Of course, I was startled by such a horrific sight, but I literally didn't believe what I was seeing. I remember saying out loud, "Wow, my imagination is really jacked up." I would just keep calling myself a stupid little kid with a stupid imagination. It helped me make sense of what I saw and made it easier to deal with, because I see a ghost, but there's no such thing. It had to be my imagination. I saw it every day after that. It would never say a word, but if I looked at it, it would lean its head at me as if it were to say, "I see you too." It always left when my family came home. but I saw this thing every day for 3 months straight. It started to get more aggressive the more uncomfortable I became. I questioned my sanity every day, just telling myself that it didn't make sense. I'm seeing a ghost, but how? Because ghosts aren't real. I would say I don't believe in ghosts because that's what I thought, but that was a ghost. I didn't understand anything, and as days went by, I became more scared every day. This thing started cutting me off. It would be so uncomfortable that I would want to go into my room upstairs. It would move slowly as if underwater, then quickly zip as if it teleported onto the stairway, leaning over the staircase while looking me in the face to block me from going to my room. I was stuck to my little corner of my couch with a smiling skeleton that wanted something from me. The best way I could relate how it moved was like the ghost from the movie 13 Ghosts. That was actually pretty spot on. I never told my parents or anyone else what I was seeing. I was afraid my parents wouldn't believe a stupid little kid, and honestly, I was afraid of getting in trouble. My brother would just call me gay and tell everyone to make fun of me. One day, I came home and this thing, like every day, was waiting for me. I sat on the couch in fear like always. This time it zipped in front of me, in front of my face, and it took its hands and shrouded them over my face as if though it wanted to grab me, then zip back. For the first time I screamed as loud as I could and ran outside. My parents came outside to me crying and asked me what was wrong, and the first thing that I said was, "I know I'm a stupid little kid with a stupid imagination and you're never going to believe me." After I told my parents, I expected them to look at each other in disbelief and make me look under my bed for monsters. They turned to each other and said in a stern voice, "Why didn't you tell us?" That scared me more than they knew because they sounded like they knew something. My parents have never told me anything that would scare me before, but my parents told me the God-honest truth as if I was grown. They told me that people that lived in the house before us had a little girl that was demon-possessed in her house and took her own life, and now the demon wanted me. My parents immediately poured baby oil into a cap and prayed over it, and put a dab of it in the shape of a cross over every door and window in the house. After that, I saw it outside my kitchen window looking in. That is the first time I saw it outside. Then a week after that, and 2 weeks after that, then I never saw it again. Whether anyone believes me or not isn't important. Whether it was my crazy 8-year-old brain like I thought or something paranormal, I saw it for 3 months straight. No one can take that from me.
This story took place around 5 years ago. I was feeling sick and came home from college early. A little background of my house. My house was located in a heavily forested area, literally in the middle of the woods. The closest neighbors were about 3 miles away. When I got there, I was completely alone. Everyone else was either at school or work. The surrounding forest was noticeably silent. Usually you would hear some birds or a light breeze passing through the trees, but today there wasn't a single noise, and it was unnerving. When I got inside the house, something felt off, but I chalked it up to me just being sick and feeling exhausted from the drive. It was around 3 p.m. when I decided to get some rest. So I got into some comfy clothes and plopped down on the couch, and within seconds I dozed off. About 2 hours later, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps upstairs. I immediately started to panic, knowing that I was still supposed to be alone in the house. But just in case, I texted all of my family and asked each of them if they were home yet. To my dismay, all of them said that they were still out. I thought that maybe I was just hearing things. Perhaps I had a vivid dream or something. Before going back to sleep, I got up and went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. As I was making my way back to the couch, I had to walk past the staircase. The very moment I stepped in front of the stairs, my stomach dropped and my heart skipped a beat. as clear as day, I heard a little girl's voice singing Mary Had a Little Lamb. I know it sounds cliche, but that's what I heard. If I could give more detail, the voice sounded like it was distorted and echoey. There was something about it that was all wrong. Considering the circumstances, it's safe to say that I've never been so terrified in my life. The voice stopped me in my tracks, and I was frozen to the spot, too afraid to even move. After a minute, I slowly made my way up the stairs and looked into the dark hallway. What the fuck? For this next part, you can chalk it up to me being dumb and having my thoughts all out of order, because I decided to slowly make my way down the hallway and towards the creepy voice. I don't know why, I just felt compelled to do so. I suddenly felt freezing, and an overwhelming sense of dread came over me. I began to shake, and soon I collapsed on the floor. I felt the urge to run, but something was pinning me down. I couldn't tell you if it was an unearthly force or my own primal fear keeping me in place. If I had to compare it to anything, imagine that you're in a canoe in the middle of the ocean, with a shark circling you, waiting for its moment to attack. I suddenly sprung up and charged back down the hallway, nearly falling down the steps as I descended them. I ran outside and just stood there for about 15 minutes before my mom came home and asked me what the hell was going on. I didn't have much of an answer, and I thought that there was no way that she would believe anything I had to say about what just happened to me. So I made up some bullshit excuse and kept the truth to myself. I've yet to experience anything quite like that again. To this day I try to rationalize the event, but to no avail. What bothers me the most is that I was somehow drawn towards the creepy voice instead of running away, which is what I should have done the moment I heard it. I tried to tell myself it was just the spirit of a little girl who played a trick on me. But in the back of my mind, I know that there is a possibility that something more sinister was at work, trying to lure me into its clutches.
Our official merch store is finally here. If you want to support more of our channel, check out our merch shop. The link is in the description down below. See you on the next video.